All right, so let's just dive right into this.
Yeah.
We're going to be taking a closer look at that midair collision near Washington, D.C.'s Ronald Reagan Airport.
Right.
Tough story, but we're going to carefully unpack what we know so far.
Yeah.
It's got some early findings and really importantly highlights the human side of this whole tragedy.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that even in a place as carefully controlled as the airspace around our nation's capital, things can still go terribly wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So picture this.
Okay.
It's February 12th, 2025. You've got an American Airlines passenger jet heading to D.C. from Wichita, Kansas.
Okay.
At the same time, there's a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter doing some night training.
Yeah.
Crew of 3 soldiers.
Yeah.
This training is really important. It helps them practice flying in tough, low-visibility conditions.
Right.
But it obviously comes with its own set of risks.
And tragically, those risks became a reality on this particular day.
Right. These 2 aircraft end up colliding.
Wow.
It happened near the airport, and the impact was devastating.
Yeah.
Everyone on board was lost, 64 people on the plane, and the 3 soldiers in the helicopter.
Oh, my goodness.
And to make matters even worse, the plane broke apart and sank into the icy Potomac River.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine the challenges the first responders faced?
I can't imagine.
Dealing with freezing temperatures and trying to recover the wreckage underwater?
It was a truly harrowing scene, no question.
Now, to get a clearer picture of what happened,
Yeah.
let's look at the moments leading up to the collision.
Okay.
Some eyewitnesses have come forward with some pretty disturbing accounts.
Yeah.
One person, Ari Schulman, saw the plane making some unusual turns, almost banking too sharply. He even described seeing streams of sparks before the impact.
Whoa.
Something was clearly very wrong.
Yeah. And another witness, Jimmy Mazzeo, saw what he called a white flare and noticed other planes in the area flying erratically, as if reacting to something unexpected. It paints a picture of chaos in the sky.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then we have the air traffic control recordings, which add a whole other layer to this. You can hear the controller desperately trying to warn the helicopter about the plane that was getting too close.
And the helicopter pilot initially responds, confirming he sees the plane.
Right.
But moments later, the collision happens.
Yeah.
This is where things get really puzzling. If the pilot knew the plane was there, why wasn't he able to avoid it?
Exactly. It's a question at the heart of the investigation.
Right.
Both the Transportation Secretary and the Defense Secretary have stated that they believe the helicopter crew knew the plane was close. This just deepens the mystery, doesn't it?
It certainly highlights the complexity of what investigators are dealing with.
Yeah.
They have these pieces of information,
Right.
but figuring out how they all fit together to explain the crash is the real challenge.
Now, while investigators are working to piece together those final moments, it's important for us to remember the human cost of this tragedy.
Of course.
64 lives were lost on that plane, people with families, dreams, and stories of their own.
Right.
Imagine a group of 6 figure skaters from Boston. They were on their way to a competition, 2 teenagers, their moms, and 2 coaches who were former world champions.
Wow.
All gone.
It's heartbreaking. And those 6 are just a fraction of the lives lost.
Yeah.
There was a young pilot excited about his career, flight attendants who dedicated themselves to keeping passengers safe, a lawyer celebrating her birthday with a trip.
Right.
The passengers came from all walks of life, representing a variety of nationalities. It really hits home that behind these numbers, there are real people whose loss is deeply felt by so many.
You're absolutely right. This isn't just about data points and flight paths. This is about real people whose lives are cut tragically short.
And their stories are just as important as understanding the technical details of what caused the crash.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the early findings of the investigation.
All right.
The good news is that they've recovered both of the black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder.
This is a huge step.
Right?
These black boxes are like the aircraft's memory.
Yeah.
They capture all sorts of data and conversations, which will be crucial in helping investigators understand what happened in those final moments.
Right. The National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, is leading the investigation and looking into a lot of factors, including the possibility of human error.
Of course.
However, there's a detail that's raising a lot of questions.
Okay.
It turns out that the helicopter was flying significantly higher than it was supposed to.
That's right. There's a permitted altitude of 200 feet for helicopters in that airspace.
Right.
But according to publicly available flight data, the Black Hawk was last recorded at about 400 feet.
Wow.
Now, that might not sound like much.
You're right.
But in this specific airspace, that extra altitude puts the helicopter directly in the path of planes approaching to land.
Yeah.
Think of it like driving on the wrong side of the road.
A recipe for disaster.
Exactly.
And a former senior air safety investigator, Greg Faith, has publicly questioned this discrepancy. He's asking why, on this particular flight, they were flying so much higher than they knew they should have been.
Yeah.
It's a question that needs a clear answer.
Right.
And it's not just investigators who are focusing on this altitude issue.
Right.
It's become a talking point in the political sphere as well.
That's right. President Trump has publicly stated that he believes the helicopter's high altitude was the direct cause of the crash. And he's also made some claims about potential issues with air traffic controller hiring standards during the previous administration.
Right.
Hinting that this might have played a role. However, it's important to remember that these are just claims at this point.
Right.
And there's no concrete evidence to support them yet.
Right. We need to separate speculation from facts.
Yeah.
The NTSB will conduct a thorough investigation and hopefully give us some clear answers.
Exactly. And speaking of the NTSB, their preliminary report should be out in about 30 days.
Okay.
It'll give us some early insights into what they think might have caused the crash.
Right.
Yes. And then there's the full investigation, which is likely to take much longer.
Right.
Potentially months or even years to complete.
Wow.
This will be an incredibly detailed process.
Yeah.
They'll analyze the data from those black boxes we talked about.
Right.
Interview air traffic controllers and other personnel and review all the relevant procedures and regulations. It's a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely essential to get to the bottom of this.
Absolutely. We need to learn from this tragedy and do everything we can to prevent something like this from happening again.
Of course.
But, while we're talking about the investigation and the technical aspects of what happened, it's easy to forget about the human element.
Right.
Behind all these facts and figures are real people who lost their lives.
That's so important to remember. And it's not just the passengers and crew. Think about their families, their friends, their communities. The ripple effect of this tragedy is enormous.
Let's take a moment to hear a bit more about some of those lives that were lost.
Okay.
We mentioned the figure skaters earlier.
Yes.
2 of those young athletes were close friends, just 14 and 16 years old. They were traveling with their mothers, both of whom were heavily involved in supporting their daughter's passion for skating.
Yeah.
And then there were the 2 coaches, former world champions themselves, dedicating their lives to mentoring the next generation of skaters. Their loss is being felt deeply within the skating community.
It's a devastating loss. And there are so many other stories like this.
Right.
One of the passengers was a young woman just starting her career as a lawyer. She was heading to D.C. for a conference and was so excited to network and learn from others in her field.
Right.
She was also a volunteer at an animal shelter and had a passion for rescuing stray dogs. Her friends and family describe her as a bright light, always full of energy and kindness.
It's just heartbreaking to hear these stories.
It is.
And it really emphasizes that these weren't just faceless passengers on a flight.
Right.
These were individuals with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them dearly.
It's also worth noting that this tragedy highlights the incredible skill and dedication of the first responders.
Yeah.
They faced incredibly difficult conditions, working tirelessly in freezing temperatures and icy waters to recover the victims and wreckage.
Right.
Their courage and commitment in the face of such a tragedy is truly remarkable.
Absolutely. Their efforts deserve our deepest respect and gratitude.
Yeah, they do.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the airspace above Washington, D.C. is incredibly complex.
It is.
Can you talk a bit more about that and what makes it such a challenging environment for pilots and air traffic controllers?
Of course.
Yeah.
You're right. It's one of the most complex airspaces in the world.
Yeah.
You've got constant traffic from domestic and international flights. Plus, you have to factor in presidential movements.
Right.
Military operations, all happening in close proximity.
Right.
It requires an incredible level of coordination and precision to keep things running smoothly.
It's like a carefully choreographed dance in the sky.
It is.
And even with all the rules and technology we have in place, things can still go wrong.
Exactly. And this tragedy is a reminder that aviation safety is an ongoing process.
Right.
It's not about achieving perfection, but about constantly learning, adapting, and improving.
So as the investigation continues, what are some of the key things you'll be watching for? What insights might help us understand how to make air travel safer in the future?
Well, I'll be particularly interested in what the NTSB finds regarding communication between the helicopter crew and air traffic control.
Okay.
Were there any missed warnings or misunderstandings?
Right.
Was the controller overloaded with too many aircraft to manage? These are crucial questions that need to be answered.
And I imagine they'll be looking closely at the helicopter's flight path and why they were flying at such a higher altitude than permitted.
Absolutely. Understanding the decision-making process of the pilots in those final moments will be critical.
Right.
Were they facing any pressure or distractions? Was there a technical malfunction that forced them to deviate from their planned route?
This brings up another important point.
Yeah.
We often think of flying as this incredibly automated process.
Right.
But ultimately, it still relies on humans making split-second decisions, often under immense pressure.
That's right. And that's why it's so important for us to understand the human factors involved in aviation accidents. It's not just about blaming individuals,
right,
but about learning how to create systems and procedures that minimize the risk of human error.
This tragedy has certainly raised a lot of questions about how we can continue to improve aviation safety.
It has.
It's a conversation that needs to continue as we learn more about what happened in those final moments above the Potomac.
Right.
You know, as we've been discussing this collision,
Yeah.
I keep thinking back to that near-miss incident we touched on earlier, the one that happened just 24 hours before, almost in the same airspace. It's almost like a warning sign, isn't it?
It's definitely something investigators will be looking into.
Right.
They'll want to see if there are any connections between the two incidents.
Yeah.
Was it just a coincidence?
Right.
Or were there underlying issues that contributed to both?
And we've also been talking about how air traffic control staffing might have been an issue.
Right.
Those reports suggesting that they weren't fully staffed at the time of the crash are pretty concerning.
You're right to be concerned. Air traffic controllers have a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
They're like the guardians of our skies.
Right.
Making sure planes stay safely separated.
Right.
If they're overworked or understaffed,
Yeah.
the risk of mistakes goes up. And those mistakes can have tragic consequences.
It makes you wonder, could the controller have missed something crucial because they were juggling too many things at once? Could that have contributed to the helicopter flying at the wrong altitude?
It's definitely a possibility, and I'm sure the NTSB will be investigating that angle.
Right.
They'll be analyzing the communication logs, radar data, and the controller's workload to see if staffing played a role.
We also can't ignore the political side of this.
Right.
President Trump has made some statements speculating about hiring standards during the previous administration, and even appointing a new temporary head of the FAA.
It's understandable that people are looking for answers, and sometimes these kinds of events can become politicized.
Right.
But it's really important to focus on the facts and let the NTSB do their job.
Yeah.
They're the experts.
Right.
And they'll conduct a thorough, impartial investigation.
At the end of the day, what matters most is finding out exactly what happened.
Right.
Why it happened,
Yeah.
and how we can prevent it from ever happening again.
Of course.
We owe that to the victims and their families.
I completely agree. This tragedy has to be a catalyst for change. We need to learn from this and make our skies as safe as they can possibly be.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this complex and heartbreaking event,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway you want our listener to walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that aviation safety is a shared responsibility.
Yeah.
It's not just about pilots or air traffic controllers.
Right.
It's about everyone involved in the system, working together to maintain the highest standards.
Right.
This tragedy reminds us that even with all the technology and regulations we have, accidents can still happen.
Yeah.
We have to be constantly vigilant, always striving to improve.
That's a powerful message. We can't become complacent.
No.
We need to keep asking questions, demanding accountability, and pushing for progress.
Right.
This tragedy has touched so many lives, and it's our responsibility to learn from it and make sure something like this never happens again. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe.